Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second session of the RPSC's initial webinar series, An Introduction to Exhibiting. I'm Greg Redner. I'm the president of the RPSC, and delighted you're here. It's so wonderful to see so many people, we're thrilled to be able to welcome people from across the globe. We had a couple of people as far away as Poland and India last year, at our last session. So that was very exciting. So I will say good morning, good afternoon, or good evening wherever you are. Tonight's topic is going to be on how to develop an idea and turn it into an exhibit. And we'll introduce our speaker in a moment. But first, we have a few particulars to take care of. The first is the RPSC always attempts to make a land acknowledgement at the beginning of any formal program. This is our way of living into reconciliation with our Indigenous brothers and sisters. Like many other organizations in Canada, the Board of Directors of the Royal Philatelic Society of Canada has chosen to acknowledge Indigenous peoples in Canada with the following statement. As a step towards reconciliation, the RPSC acknowledges that our national office in Toronto stands on the traditional territory of many First Nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Our national office is covered by Treaty 13 and the Williams Treaties. Furthermore, we acknowledge that Indigenous people did not give up the lands that they had been on for thousands of years that now constitute Canada. We also acknowledge that Europeans did not discover Canada or arrive on an uninhabited land. The RPSC acknowledges that Canada is covered by many treaties and modern lands, resources, and self-government agreements with Indigenous people, and that many provisions of these agreements remain still unfulfilled. The RPSC further acknowledges that many Indigenous peoples in Canada have not had their rights fully recognized and implemented according to the United National Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The RPSC pledges to promote recognition and knowledge of Indigenous peoples in Canada and elsewhere, and their cultures through philately. We will also work towards building positive relationships with Indigenous peoples in Canada. I mentioned before we began to record that if you're in the crowd tonight and you would like to tell us where you're from and anything else about yourself, we're going to have a drawing at the end for David Piercy's wonderful book, Let's Talk Exhibiting, and we will mail these out to you and would be delighted to share them with somebody. If you have a copy of the book and you still want to say hello, please indicate I don't want the book so that we don't send it to someone who already has one. Next Tuesday, our third session will be with Andrew McFarlane. My apologies, Andrew. I put an A in your name, and I apologize for that. He's going to be talking about the creation of the philatelic synopsis, and I hope partly title page as well. If you don't know Andrew's remarkable book, Creating the Philatelic Exhibit Synopsis, it's really worth getting a copy of. It's a masterclass in how to do this, and I know that he's going to share a lot of really wonderful information with us next week. So please come back and be part of that one as well. So I'd like to introduce Andrew Kelley now. I'm going to stop my sharing. I'd like to introduce Andrew Kelley. I first met Andrew last year when I was doing an apprenticeship judging at the Garfield Perry March Party. We ended up eating lunch together, and I was immediately impressed with how easy he was to talk to, and how generous he was with the information he shared. He is, as you will hear in his biography, an accomplished exhibitor. He's an editor of a number of philatelic journals. He is a master, I will say, of Adobe InDesign. We can perhaps have another course on that some other time. But here's about Andrew. Andrew's philatelic journey began in 4th grade with a beginner stamp album from his school's book club. After attending the American Philatelic Society's summer seminar several times, he assembled a successful national and international youth exhibit. Following a break from stamps for Harvard Law School, family, and early career, Andrew returned to the hobby roughly 8 years ago. Since then, he has written extensively about stamps and postal history, earning the United States Stamp Society's 2023 Hopkinson Literature Award for one of his articles. He is the editor of the Auxiliary Markings Journal, of the Auxiliary Markings Club, and he recently became editor of the United States Specialist, the monthly journal of the USSS. Andrew also serves on the APS Expert Committee and as the co-chairman of the United Stamp Specialist Society Washington-Franklin Committee. Andrew returned to exhibiting in late 2022, and since then his exhibit of the U.S. offset lithographed Washington-Franklin heads won the 2023 George Brett Cup, 2 grand awards, and numerous other prizes. He's an apprentice philatelic judge and is scheduled to complete his apprenticeship this summer. Outside of philately, Andrew is a business litigation attorney and a semi-professional outdoor photographer. He lives in Denver, Colorado, with his wife and children. So, Andrew, welcome, and we really look forward to what you have to say. So, please take it away.
Thanks, Greg. I appreciate the introduction, and it's a huge honor to be here. So, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm trying to turn on my camera, but I cannot. So, I will just jump straight to the presentation.
Okay,
So,
I'll try to. In the meantime, Andrew, I'll try and see if I can do anything to allow you to do that.
very good. All right, and so as Greg said, today we're going to talk about how to take an idea, take a collection, and turn it into an effective exhibit. If I can. And so to get there, we'll talk about the 6 things that you can see on your screen. I think it's helpful to understand sort of exhibiting goals and rules up front, and then we can talk about a sort of series of choices and definitions that I think are helpful in defining an effective exhibit and telling the story effectively. And as you can see, we'll conclude with a brief overview of a sort of effective exhibit write-up, although that could be the subject of its own webinar series. And as Greg mentioned, I'll stop at the end of each chapter. So if folks have questions, I hope that you'll send them. We'll necessarily go through this material quickly, but I want to make sure we're not overlooking any burning questions that you might have. And the last thing I'll say before we move off the agenda slide, we're going to describe the process today in a somewhat linear way. You decide on the precise sort of boundaries of your topic and the scope, title your exhibit, make an outline, and write it up. I think in reality, you'll find that the process we're going to talk about today is necessarily an iterative one. Uh, you uh, you'll bounce back and forth as you outline the material. You'll appreciate something about scope and vice versa. So we'll talk about it linearly, but I don't want folks to be misled by that. It's in fact it's a very iterative process.
Andrew, I think you can put
Yes.
your camera on now. So let's
Okay.
go ahead if you can.
Very good. Hmm. Well, it still seems not, this is very odd. I use this camera every day for many hours a day, and it does not seem to be working. Let's try this. Well, I apologize. I don't know what's going on there. Let us will we will continue rather than
Perfect.
uh yeah, my apologies. Like I said, I use this camera for 6 hours today. I really don't know what's going on. Okay. So first up, goals and rules. I think it's really helpful as you're taking an idea and turning it into an exhibit to think about why you're doing that. There are lots of reasons to exhibit. People want to show off their knowledge, their research. People love to compete. You like to tell a story. But really, whatever goal you're hoping to serve by exhibiting, you can accomplish that goal. You can communicate most effectively by linking the material in your exhibit together to sort of communicate the reason why you put it together. Effective exhibiting is really effective storytelling. It's effectively linking linking together the material that you're going to exhibit, and we'll talk a lot about how to do that in a few moments. As Greg said, I'm a lawyer, and so I naturally gravitate to rules, kind of in the rules business. But in seriousness, I think the single most important thing you can do to turn an idea into an exhibit is to take a read through the manual of philatelic judging and exhibiting. You'll discover that there are actually very few rules, although they're important. There are rules about things like not like labeling photocopies and owning the material in your exhibit, things like that. Uh, but there's also lots of very helpful guidance for new and experienced exhibitors. It's very helpful, I think, to understand how an exhibit is scored, what the judges are going to look for. And I also think it's incredibly helpful because the manual describes a number of different exhibit types and sort of expresses the norms about what might typically be included in an exhibit of that type. You're free to ignore those norms, but if you're getting started, it's helpful to understand what a typical aerophilately exhibit looks like, or what a traditional exhibit looks like. And the manual will give you some great help in that regard. Of course, the manual is free. You can download it from the APS website. We'll have a link later on in the webinar. All right, well, let's start. Actually, let me stop there. As I said, I was going to stop between chapters. Questions about that? Comments?
I don't think we have any questions.
Okay, great. Well, we will keep rolling. So you really face two basic choices when you first begin transforming an idea into an exhibit. The first choice is just what kind of exhibit you're planning to show, right? The manual, as I mentioned, mentions a wide variety of exhibits. You can see them listed on the screen. And you have the freedom to choose something that's outside of those categories. If you want to try an experimental exhibit, you're sort of free to define what that looks like, that you can mix and match. But I think it's helpful at the outset to sort of decide what topic or excuse me, what category you're planning to exhibit in, because that will inform your choices as you start to refine your purpose, your story, and the outline. The other big choice to make at the outset is whether you're going to exhibit a single frame exhibit or a multi-frame exhibit. Single frame exhibits are appealing because it's a lot less work to put together 16 pages than it is to put together a 5 or 8 or 10 frame exhibit. Much more work there, particularly as you're learning, because you're likely to remount your exhibit, refocus it a number of times. Often a good place for novices to start. But the downside is telling an effective story in exactly 16 pages is really hard. You really don't have a lot of slop. There are a lot of great bite-sized philatelic stories that are just a little bit too short to tell in 16 pages or a little bit too long. And you just don't have a lot of room to develop your story. It's sort of like writing a haiku instead of writing a novel. Can be very rewarding, but it can also be very challenging. Multi-frame exhibits, on the other hand, much more work. On the other hand, you have more room to develop your story. It's easier to make a story fit and sort of less concerned about being exactly the right length. It's fine to start with a multi-frame exhibit of any length that's more than one. On the other hand, typically exhibits do better if they have 5 frames or more. So it sort of helps if you're in a tweener 2 or 3 frame exhibit, you might want to redefine your scope a little bit to either down to a 1 frame or up to more frames. Yeah, I think that's a critical decision. Oftentimes, by the way, I'll say you'll hear people express an interest in starting with a single frame exhibit and later expanding to a multi-frame exhibit. I think that is fine if it works for your story. But my experience is stories that can be effectively told in a single frame are really quite different than stories that one might tell in a multi-frame exhibit. So if that's your plan, you want to think about whether you really have the kind of story that can make that transition. All right. I think the single most important part of novice exhibiting and of turning an idea into an exhibit is being very, very precise and clear about what your exhibit is about. Oftentimes, when I'm judging exhibits from novice exhibitors, you'll see that the concept in the exhibit is sort of unclear. That ultimately manifests in the exhibit being somewhat confusing. There's unclear whether the material is in or out of the exhibit, and you wind up with a confusing story. So I strongly recommend that when you are making the transition uh, from an idea to an exhibit, that you sit down and think very, very carefully about what's your story. You can see on the screen, your best exhibit stories are typically described very succinctly. You should be able to tell your story in a sentence or two. When you're deciding on a story, obviously it should fit the material that you have or fit a portion of the material. We'll talk about this some more, but the story should be one that you can tell effectively. If you're thinking about the story that you're going to use to frame your material, think about whether you have the knowledge or whether you can acquire the knowledge to tell that story. My video is still not working. I apologize. I will. Uh, Sorry, back to the.
That's fine. That's fine. I thought I had discovered what it was, but
Yeah, I
anyway,
think it's a setting in my Zoom, unfortunately. I just don't understand why it is not allowing me to turn it on, but it's not.
well, I can
Uh,
tell you, Andrew is definitely like absolutely a handsome guy. So we'll get a picture of him up there somewhere.
okay, well, I haven't given myself a haircut today. I'm really disappointed that I'm not on video. Um, Sorry, so back to the picking your story. Think about a story that you can tell effectively, that you have the knowledge to tell, and also think about stories where you have the key material. As you think about what your story is, do you have the pieces of that story that you would need to convey it effectively? Obviously, the story's got to be able to fit in the number of frames that you've chosen. Uh, Pick an interesting story. Surprisingly, not everyone does that. I see people who seem to pick stories that aren't particularly interesting to the viewer or to them. Pick something that you're excited about and that you think other people will be excited about. And lastly, as you think about a story, and we'll talk about this more as we talk about the plan and the outline of your exhibit, there's a temptation as you set up your story, your scope of your exhibit, to exclude things that you don't have. And Americans call it, we sort of gerrymander the exhibit so it fits your collection and sort of skips the hard parts. You can do that at the margins, but at some point the judges will not appreciate it if it looks like you've tried to sort of contort your story so that it fits material and excludes some parts that people would think are traditionally part of the topic uh, that you're on about. So why do we start with purpose and scope? The the answer is, it's in modern exhibiting, the rules, as such as they are, allow you as the exhibitor to define exactly what your task is. You tell the judges your goal, that's your purpose. You tell them what materials you're going to show, your scope to achieve that purpose, and the judges will assess uh, how well you met your goal and how difficult the goal was. And it turns out this is so important that best practice for exhibitors is to put the purpose statement right at the very beginning of the exhibit, so there can be no doubt about what's going on there. This is the top of my title page, and I'll have some more discussion about title pages next week. But you can see I'm telling the judges here, look, here's what this exhibit's going to do, or what I hope it's going to do. And you as a judge can look at this purpose and scope statement and decide how well I did. Let's look at a few other examples. The first one here is obviously the one mine uh, from the prior screen, but you can see it tells the judges very specifically what we're going to study. What's in the exhibit, what's out of the exhibit, the date ranges. The second example there is from a very well-known exhibit of Burma by Mike Clay. Again, if you read this, you have no idea about, or you have a very clear idea, excuse me, about exactly what was going to be shown in the exhibit, the time frame, what materials in the exhibit and out of the exhibit. Uh, and the last one I think is quite interesting. This is from a thematic exhibit that I judged a couple of weeks ago in in San Francisco. And again, you can see here it's a thematic exhibit, and so the exhibitor is focused on his thematic story, not the philatelic material. But you can read that and see exactly the type of information he's going to convey in his exhibit, um, using the stamp that covers that he's showing. On the flip side, we can have some examples that are not maybe not such a great idea for the purpose and scope. Right? You can see the first one obviously is just too generic, an exhibit of dogs. We sort of don't know what that includes. We don't know really what story the exhibitor is trying to tell. We don't have a good idea of what uh, subjects or philatelic materials in or out. Not very effective. The second one is the kind of gerrymandering or contortion that I talked about. We very often see, particularly in postal history exhibits, exhibitors who will define the scope and purpose of their exhibit based on the material in their collection. And so you'll see exhibits that start or end on random dates or include or exclude random things because that's what the exhibitor has in their collection. I wouldn't do that. Try to, if you're exhibiting a topic, pick a scope, pick a date, pick a boundary that's sort of meaningful to the topic and not just the earliest or latest thing you happen to have. The third example is another example of gerrymandering. Uh, if you're going to show American fancy cancels, the Waterbury cancels, there's one on the screen there. They're the most famous. A judge is going to wonder why you define the scope of your exhibit to exclude what seems like uh, a really significant part of the story. And the last one I threw in, I think you can see the obvious problem there. The exhibitor is going to have a one frame exhibit, but include a topic that could be 100 frames. Just not a great purpose and scope. It's not going to fit well within the story that the exhibitor is trying to tell. All right. Uh, once you've decided the purpose and scope, that is, once you decided why you want to exhibit and what material you're going to use to convey your why, it's time to think about the title of the exhibit. I strongly recommend working on the title after you have worked out the purpose and the scope, and maybe even after you've done an outline of your exhibit, because the title really is going to be the distillation of that work. You know, succinctly capture the story, the subject matter, the scope of your exhibit. Ideally, the judges ought to be able to read the title and know exactly what your exhibit is about without looking at anything else. As you're coming up with a title, I recommend thinking about two things. The first is focus on a descriptive title rather than a title that's cute or creative. Very often we see exhibitors that have titles that are sort of charming or funny or whatever, but they don't really give you a good sense of what is in or out of the exhibit. That ultimately winds up being ineffective. Uh, and also be careful. Titles are another opportunity to kind of lose sight on the focus and purpose of your exhibit, the scope and purpose. It's not uncommon for exhibitors to have a really broad title that accidentally sweeps in things that they don't really intend to show in their exhibit. And I put the inverted Jenny on here because a classic example is someone who has a great airmail collection of the early US. They define the title in precisely, and suddenly the judges wonder where the where the great I guess the great rarity is in their collection, even though their exhibit's really not um, about inverted jetties.
Andrew, before you go on, can I ask a question,
Yes, please.
which I think is something that others might be thinking of too? Suppose you can't afford or don't have access to buy the key piece, like the inverted Jenny. How do you handle that in your statement of purpose? If you get to that later, feel free to pass over it. But I just think it's sometimes scary to say, look, I can't afford this, or I will never be able to acquire it. How do you handle that if you have to say that?
It's a really great question. We do have some slides in this later, but I think we'll jump into it now. Um, it's fine. Judges understand that people don't have unlimited resources to spend on their collections. And so at least what my practice is to explain to the judges, I don't have a particular thing. I'll mention that often in my synopsis that Andrew will talk about next week. Uh, Maybe I'll mention why I don't have it. Either it hasn't been for sale or it's outside of my means. Uh, and then I try to convey to the judges in the synopsis or in my exhibit how missing that key piece doesn't really detract from my story. Uh, examples we'll see in the great example I have of that, and we'll see in a few slides. I have a friend who collects the United States Pan American issues. It's really a beautiful, beautiful exhibit of the advertising covers, stamps, uses, but there are a couple of the inverts that are $60,000 a piece. He doesn't have those, never going to have them. He explains to the judges that that's really not part of his story. His exhibit tells an excellent story without the material, and he's done quite well. So bottom line, I wouldn't be afraid of missing those great rarities. The judges will understand that. You should acknowledge you don't have them, so that to show the judges that you know your subject matter, and then tell your story without them.
Great, thanks.
Mm-hmm. All right. Part of defining your purpose and scope is deciding what material from your exhibit you want to include or not include. Uh, as we mentioned earlier, uh, there are different norms for different types of exhibits. People include different things in a first day cover exhibit, for example, than in a postal history exhibit or a postal stationery exhibit. You get a good sense of that if you're starting out by, again, taking a quick look at the Manual of Philatelic Judging. There are sections that talk about each exhibit type. Find those to be very helpful. It's also a great idea just to review similar exhibits for ideas about how people typically tell stories, what kind of material they include, what kind of material they don't include. Uh, Beyond that, you want to just think about what you've defined your purpose and scope. So the material you include in your exhibit should be materials that advances the story, right? Successful exhibits are selective. A collector will go through their collection and identify the pieces that help them tell that story. Uh, Less successful exhibits are just sort of a dump of the collection. People will be non-selective and they'll put in everything, or very often you see exhibitors that will include things that are really beautiful philatelic items, but either are on the periphery of their subject or outside of the subject. That winds up being less effective. You sort of lose the story because you're wondering why is this thing here? How does this fit in with the story? Greg, this touches on the point you mentioned a moment ago. To be an effective exhibit, you have to have enough material to tell the story, but judges don't expect completeness. I shared the story a moment ago about my friend who collects these beautiful uh, Pan stamps. Uh, he has one of the inverts, but not the other two. His exhibit has been very successful because he's able to tell his story without having all those pieces and acknowledging he doesn't have them and sort of moving on. Uh, Also, as you're thinking about material to tell this story, you want to think about having a balanced selection of material. Very often in collections, for whatever reason, we'll have a lot of material that relates to one aspect of a subject, less material that relates to a different aspect, either because it's more expensive or it's rare or there's just random happenstance. As you think about what material you want to include in your exhibit, you want to try to have as much balance as you can so that the sections don't seem like um, they're out of proportion. And then the last thing is you're thinking about what material that you want to include in your story is to look for opportunities for after rare or difficult to acquire material. Um, Oftentimes as collectors, and particularly as people who are starting out in exhibiting, we think that rare means expensive, right? We're thinking about these inverts over here that are like $60,000 US a piece or something like that. And certainly rare and expensive do go together. But as you get deeper in your subject, you often find things that are very unusual uh, and are very difficult to acquire, but that are not expensive or that are within your means. Judges ultimately will look for that, and you have material in your collection that's hard to acquire, hard to collect. And so as you're thinking about assembling your exhibit, deciding what material to include, look for opportunities like that. I have some stamps in my exhibit that I paid only a few dollars for, and there are probably only 2 or 3 examples in the world. Quite hard to collect, quite hard to find. You get a lot of credit in telling your story with that type of material, but you can do it without having to mortgage your house. And oftentimes, particularly with new collectors, we're not quite sure of what material ought to be in our exhibit to tell the story. And so you can see on the screen there lots of great references to sort of think about what a complete story might look like. Again, I recommend strongly looking at as many other exhibits as you can, either online or in person, even better. Obviously, we know reference books, articles, and catalogs. Engage with specialists in your area, talk to fellow collectors, think about what people who collect what you collect consider to be essential to your story. And then also don't be afraid to look for non-philatelic references to help you think about the parameters of your story. Particularly for thematic exhibits, it's appropriate to look for um, to see how non-philatelic authors treat a subject. But oftentimes you can find helpful ideas about that, even for philatelic subjects. If you're telling a postal history exhibit about a particular war, for example, or a political change, reading a history of that event, thinking about what portions of that event the author thinks are particularly important, or that what portion of that event the author uses to structure his narrative, can give you some insights into the material you would want to sort of mirror uh, that structure or that treatment in your own exhibit.
We do have two questions before we
Wonderful.
go on, if that's okay. Glenn Minchell asks, so if you do have an upside down Jenny, you would be awarded rarity points. I think maybe another way to frame the question is if you really do have things that are rare and valuable, does that work to your benefit more, say, than just normal rarity?
Yeah, the Jenny is actually a weird example because it's not the Jenny is not it's super expensive, but it's not that hard to acquire if you have the money, right? Anybody on this call could have a Jenny by the end of the week if they won the lottery. So judges typically are not going to look for things that are scarce, where there's lots of demand and they're expensive. The judges are going to look for things that are genuinely difficult to acquire. And sometimes those have a high price tag and sometimes they don't. But you can do well on rarity without having the expensive stuff. And obviously having beautiful scarce stamps is not going to hurt your exhibit either.
Okay, great. And then Jean Wang asked, for one of my one frame exhibits, I have a subtitle that is creative, but also a regular descriptive title. Is that okay?
I think it is. Fundamentally, it's sort of all of the things that we're talking about here are about clarity of communication. Judges have a really limited amount of time to figure out what your exhibit's about, figure out the story that you've set for yourself, at the task you set for yourself rather, and figure out whether you've how well you've achieved that task. So you don't want to do things that are going to confuse the judges or delay that process. My guess is that Gene's creative subtitle wouldn't have that effect. The judges could read the main title and then read Gene's statement of purpose and scope and not be confused. But really, the watchword is just make it easy for the judges to understand what you're up to. Don't confuse them.
Okay, thank you.
All right. So to this point, we've talked about how to define the scope of your exhibit, like what things are in your story and what are out of your story, and what you're hoping to achieve. Why are you exhibiting? What's the goal that the judges are going to um, measure your exhibit against? Once you have that down clearly in your head, it's time to think about how you're going to take that material and take that story and turn it into an effective storyline or outline of your exhibit. Again, this is telling your story in a clear and organized way is incredibly important. As we said before, and I'll emphasize again, judges are under an enormous amount of time pressure when they're assessing exhibits. If you imagine you had a 200 frame exhibit, 200 frame exhibition, 16 pages of frame, the judges are looking at north of 3,000 pages, and they typically have a day or less than a day to do that. And so having a structure that really clearly organizes your material is easy to digest and tells your story well is critically important. And I think probably the single most important thing in taking your idea and transforming it into an exhibit. Being very clear about how you're organizing it and how you're telling your story. Uh, Sometimes when we're being fancy, we'll talk about this storyline or this outline as the plan. But all this really means is what's the outline of your exhibit? How are you going to put it together? Um, the good news is, as I said before, the only requirement is that your story makes sense. There's no hard and fast rule about how to assemble an exhibit. And even subjects like the one I exhibit, which are traditional when people think of sort of a rigid structure, really do give you a lot of leeway in how to structure your story, how to put it together. But I suppose that's also the bad news. You're free to do whatever you want. There really aren't any guardrails or any rules, and so you can exercise your creativity, but you don't have a lot of bounds on that creativity. You can see in the screen there typical ideas for storylines. The chronological story is the one that is most common, particularly outside of thematic or topical exhibits, right? We naturally think of beginning, middle, end. Uh, Oftentimes, catalogs group stamps in a chronological way. It's a natural and it can be a very effective way to tell lots of different stories. Also, effective exhibits tell stories geographically, particularly if you have a big or complicated exhibit. Maybe you'll group the stamps or the covers or whatever in your exhibit by the geography. Obviously, by stamp issue is a common way to group it. Uh, and then if you're doing a thematic or a topical exhibit, you'll your grouping will be dictated by your non-philatelic subject rather than your philatelic one. Maybe you'll use the uh, sequence of events if it's a thematic exhibit that you're going to show to organize your exhibit. If you're exhibiting penguins, for example, if it's a topical exhibit, you might group your exhibit by penguin species. Um, but that'll give you some ideas. Fundamentally, though, you just want an organization that is simple and that makes sense and that a judge can understand quickly. If judges are confused, they're not going to be able to understand your story. They're not going to think that you achieved your purpose very effectively, and that's bad. Your audience won't understand what you're doing. If you have an easy story that people can grasp, your exhibit will be more effective in completing your purpose. Uh, Almost without fail, key parts of a philatelic story will have a beginning and a middle and an end. Those can be very different. I'm thinking of Jean's blood exhibit. Jean's going to start in that exhibit in a much different way than I would start her in a traditional philatelic exhibit or the way a postal history exhibitor might start and end their exhibit. But there's something about human psychology that we just think about stories having these three elements. And so no matter what you're exhibiting, I would strongly encourage you to think about how you can use this structure to put together an effective story. Uh, in the beginning uh, of the story, you're often going to introduce a topic, particularly in a thematic or in a topical exhibit. Uh, Oftentimes in traditional exhibits, we'll show either the very first thing in our story or commonly exhibit things that sort of set up the story. For example, in my traditional exhibit, you'll see we have some archival material to set the stage uh, for the later material in my exhibit. Bureau of Engraving and Printing for my stamps was experimenting with some new printing technologies. They produced the stamps on your screen and a few other items. Then later went on to use that same technology to print the stamps. So I'll start my exhibit with that. Other exhibits will start with some proofs or essays, but you want sort of an anchor. Like, well, here's the beginning of the story. Here's a logical uh, starting spot. Typically, after we set up the beginning, we'll move to the meat of the exhibit, right? Here's where we're telling the bulk of our story. So if, again, I exhibit the stamp issue you can see on the screen, obviously the lion's share of my exhibits could be focused on telling the story of those stamps. Thematic exhibit, different. You're going to dig into the theme of your story, and so on. The middle is often very long. You'll often subdivide the middle into some additional chapters so that the organization is obvious and the judges will know where you are. But the middle of the exhibit is where you're going to do the lion's share of your storytelling and show the bulk of your material. And I think the hardest part for exhibitors, and maybe one of the most confusing ones, is the end, right? think we all know intuitively that a story needs a conclusion. It's just I think it's a human psychological imperative to have to know how a story wraps up, to figure out why the exhibit stopped where it did. Uh, I think we as exhibitors and judges have made this maybe a little more complicated than it needs to be. We very often hear about people talking about an epilogue. Here's sort of the next thing that came after with the stamps that I'm showing. Here's the next thing in the story after the story I'm telling. But really, the point here, with whatever fancy labels you want to use, is just you need a way for your story to end. I don't have an epilogue in my exhibit, for example. I conclude my exhibit with the two items you can see on the screen. The top one here is the last stamp that was issued in the series that I exhibit. And it turns out this was the last day and hour that the stamp was valid for postage. The post office department closed this Shanghai post office right after it canceled the stamp. It's a great way to end, right into the story, last stamp, last use. And then I try to explain, which is maybe it's a quasi epilogue, why there weren't any more stamps printed by lithography, like the ones that I'm exhibiting. The reason for that was there were a bunch of postal forgeries, and so I conclude my exhibit with those postal forgeries, which both explain why the stamps weren't why the series wasn't continued, and also chronologically just happened to fit kind of at the end of my story. The message of all this, though, is just think about an ending. Don't get confused about epilogue. Don't get confused about how fancy it has to be. Just think you're telling a story. Why did that story end where it did? Does it end because the stamps were replaced? Does it end because the political entity that you're talking about in your exhibit was defunct? Does it end because you completed the sort of the story of your thematic exhibit? Just think about how you're going to end the story. Uh, Common pitfalls that I see in as I'm looking at people's outlines, looking at their plans. Uh, the most common one is people don't have a plan. It's sort of rather than exhibit, it's just a collection where the exhibitor kind of toss some things into the frames without a logical story or any kind of thread that connects the frames together. Uh, Another common difficulty is the structure is hard to follow. And particularly here, we see that people are often make stories that are too complicated. We, as specialists in our chosen philatelic fields or thematic or topical fields, love our subject. We know a lot about it. We love all the millions of nooks and crannies that one could pursue as they think about that subject. But sometimes that love and that complexity manifests itself in a story that's just too complicated for a judge to digest or a viewer to digest quickly. And so strive for simplicity rather than complicated and difficult to follow. We've talked about contrived structures before uh, when we talked about the scope and subject of an exhibit. Sometimes we can see that carried through in our storyline, in our outline. Try to pick a storyline that doesn't feel contrived, that fits this kind of common conception of what your subject is about, or sort of fits your story. It doesn't feel like you're trying to jigger it in some way. Another common mistake that new exhibitors make is to slavishly adhere to catalog order. This is particularly an issue in more traditional types of exhibits, but very often the catalogs that we use they put the stamps together in a way that makes for a neat catalog, but don't actually fit the story. The stamps I exhibit are a great example of that. The stamps were issued into sort of a weird sequence of denominations, and the order that the stamps were sold to the public doesn't have any relation to the catalog at all. So if you put the exhibit in catalog order, you'd be missed the whole story. Like pick a good story and decide on what that order should be. Don't feel like you're chained to the catalog. Another common mistake we see is when people organize exhibits is there's a very strong impetus towards, particularly in more traditional types of exhibits, putting the stamps or the unused items first and then sticking the covers at the end uh, for no good reason, right? This is particularly problematic if there's multiple stamp issues. You might have sections of an exhibit that talk about different stamp issues, and then there's a break, and then you have covers for the different stamp issues. You can see how that can confuse the story or break it up or impede the flow. Think about if you have different parts of your exhibit, think about why you're putting those parts where you are. Um, We talked about showing a collection instead of a focused exhibit. Be selective. Include your storyline should just include the items and the points in the story that are necessary to carry your purpose and your um, goal. And then lastly, a common pitfall in storytelling is including items or groups of items that don't fit the story. And I have the one example here on the screen is one of the favorite items from my collection. I love this error very much. It's very rare, and I've searched for it for a long time before I bought it. I would love to put it in my exhibit. It has nothing to do with my exhibit, and so I have to resist. Um, make sure you resist. Don't plop in items in your outline just because you like them and they don't advance the story. Let's go through a bunch of examples. I think that's the most helpful way to see this. The first set of examples are for traditional exhibits. And these are plans, outlines. These will actually be reproduced on the title page of an exhibit, typically. I know we'll talk about that more next week. But you can see these tend to be very linear and chronologically driven. The one on the left is from my exhibit. The one on the right is from the United States of Columbia exhibit by Alfredo Froelich, a really outstanding exhibit of early Columbian stamps. The next example is from our first day cover exhibit. This is from a exhibit from Tony Dewey, a really excellent and award-winning exhibit of a stamp to celebrate the tercentenary of Connecticut. You can see here, this is an outline that's not chronological at all, but it effectively groups the material. I can imagine looking at different places in Tony's frames and understanding where those portions of the frames fit into this outline, and it feels like a natural way to tell the story. This next example is from a postal history exhibit. This is actually a one-frame exhibit from Chip Goldman about Rupert's Land. And you can see here, this is a nice example of a geographic and chronological description of a story. Simple outline, but it captures the material in the exhibit in a way that sort of makes sense, doesn't feel contrived, it's easy to understand. There are 4 routes. Here are the routes. I'm going to go through each one of them in my exhibit. Boom. That's easy to get, makes for an effective grouping. Last example is a thematic exhibit. This is from an exhibitor named Fran Adams. And you can see here, because it's a thematic exhibit and she's trying to tell a non-philatelic story using philatelic material, her exhibit is driven by the chronology of an event that she wants to tell the viewer about. And again, if you looked at sort of histories of the event that she's talking about here, or you're familiar with this history, she's picked material and picked chapters for that material that fit big historical developments or chunks of the story. Lastly is a topical exhibit. This is actually from my kid who has a youth exhibit of penguins. Sorry for the formatting, not the most beautiful formatted outline in the world. The point here you can see is that unlike a lot of the other types of plans or structures we talked about, topical exhibits tend to be much more it's almost what's the right word? Well, I mean, much more driven, much more sort of outline oriented and less story oriented. Like this is almost a taxonomy. You can have an effective exhibit that's a taxonomy of the penguins grouped by different geographies or grouped by different taxa or different relationships. Challenge here, though, is you still want to think about how you're going to have a beginning and end, how you're going to think about introducing the viewer to this topic, and before you take it on a forced march through the geography of penguins. I think this exhibit probably could do a little better about that, frankly, particularly around the beginning. All right. So we've talked a lot about how we're going to define what our exhibit's about, and then we're going to think about an outline for how we're going to present that material. Saying that we're going to do an outline, it sounds simple. In fact, that tends to, for me at least, to be the most time-consuming part of building that plan that effectively shows my material. And I've tried a bunch of different ways to get to that effective storyline, that effective plan. Um, One of them, if you know your material well and you know the subject well, sit down and write an outline before you start throwing material together. One I do very often in InDesign is do a mock-up in the software. I have all my covers and stamps scanned, and so I can lay out a blank exhibit frame and move things around until I think that they tell a coherent story, and then I will sort of write that up in the plan of my exhibit. Other folks like to do stock sheets or just take physical covers and stamps and lay them on their kitchen table. Uh, Also highly recommend stealing successful ideas from other exhibits that look like yours. And then lastly, I think it's really helpful to talk through your story with a friend or with a spouse. My wife is not a stamp collector, but she will listen patiently as I talk about my exhibit. And I find if I can tell her the outline of my story and it makes sense to her, it's likely to make sense to judges. It's likely to make sense to other um, viewers of the exhibit. And yeah, but this is really is the most time consuming, difficult, iterative process. You're going to go through lots and lots of outlines and move your material around a lot until you're convinced that you have a really tight story that flows well from beginning to end. Um, this chapter is continuing, but perhaps we'll pause there in case there are questions. I've been doing a lot of talking.
Sure. A couple of questions. One is a bibliography or index or reference of materials that you use in your exhibit required at the end of the exhibit?
That is an excellent question. Um, Typically, people will include material like that in their synopsis, which I know we'll talk about next week. You can include material both to show the judges that you know what you're talking about, but more importantly, to help the judges prepare to look at your uh, exhibit. Uh, there's a few people put bibliographical information on the title page of the exhibit. I probably wouldn't do that. Space is precious, and people are digesting your exhibit quickly. I think that's probably best left for your synopsis, in my view.
Okay, great. And the other question is, could you just briefly explain the difference between a topical and a thematic exhibit?
That's a great question, and I'm sorry I went through that so quickly. So a thematic exhibit is going to use philatelic material to tell a non-philatelic story. So we saw earlier there was a story of the United Nations. You might, Gene, who I know is on the call, has a beautiful thematic exhibit that talks about blood. There's a million different storylines that you can tell, but they're non-philatelic storylines told using a variety of philatelic material. The topical exhibit is a little more focused. I mean, I was going to say a little more simple. The goal of the topical exhibit is to show as many depictions of your chosen topic on philatelic items. So if you're exhibiting penguins, you're gonna have as many depictions of penguins as you possibly can. Hopefully, explaining the significance of the stamps that you're showing along the way and showing some knowledge of the penguins of their. You can talk about their feeding habits or their geography or their genetic relationships to between different species or what have you. But it's really about showing as many depictions of the topic as you can. Is that a helpful differentiation?
Yeah, I think that's great. Thank you.
Maybe put it slightly differently. There might be items um, in a thematic exhibit that don't have any depiction of the theme. One of the great examples I'm thinking of from Gene's exhibit, for example, I believe there's a penny black where there are letters in the corners of the stamps to denote the plate position, and the letters match a blood type, right? That's a beautiful item for a thematic exhibit. Lets you pivot off of that and talk about blood types. It doesn't have any picture of blood at all. Whereas, like in my child's penguin exhibit, it'd be very odd to have any items in there that weren't pictures of penguins.
Yeah.
That's the basic idea.
Jean has actually added something that's really helpful. She said a topical exhibit is like an illustrated catalog. A thematic exhibit is like an illustrated storybook.
That's beautiful. I'm going to
Yeah.
steal that, Gene.
Thanks, Jean.
Okay, so now we're going to transition from lots of this theory about what your sort of the scope and purpose of your exhibit and the outline to how you actually realize that in the exhibit. And I know we're this part will be brief because I'm about to be mindful of people's time, but I think it's important to talk a little bit about how to actually realize your outline uh, in your exhibit. So first of all, obviously your exhibit ought to carefully follow your plan. The judges are going to look at your plan. They're going to look at your exhibit to see whether it matches. They'll be confused. The viewer will be confused if it doesn't. Oftentimes, exhibitors will include, once they have a plan of their exhibit, they'll include a specific notation on each page about what that page is showing and what part of the plan it relates to. I'll show some examples of this in a minute. It's hard to visualize, but once you see it, I think it's quite easy. Um, but the important thing to think about is a judge should be able to pick a random page in your exhibit and figure out where they are in your story, figure out why that page fits in your plan. This is important for a couple of reasons. One, when judges judge exhibits, they will do just that. Look at the beginning, look at the end, and then pick a few pages in the middle to see whether the story coheres. But also, judges and even other non-judge viewers are necessarily going to look at your exhibit quickly. And if they're confused about where they are in the story or where a particular page fits in the story, your exhibit's going to be less effective. And so we try a good practice is just to hit people over the head um, with exactly where they are in the story. And we'll get into examples in a second here, but the last bit of sort of plan or story realization is, right, we have levels of organization starting with our purpose and scope. Then we have our plan that dictates the broad chapters of the exhibit. But even below the plan, I would implore you as you develop an exhibit and realize your idea to strive for an organized, consistent, logical structure. So even within the chapters of your plan, uh, again, the watchword here is to make your story something that the judges and the viewers can digest quickly, understand quickly what's going on, where it fits in the story. So just because you're at a deep level of detail that's below your big chapter headings in your plan, still very important to make sure that that you're organizing material in an easy to understand, comprehensible way. So this is very theoretical. Let's talk about a few examples. You can hear a few more from my exhibit. Um, from my exhibit has, I think, 4 or 5 chapters. I start each chapter here with an obvious indication, right? If I'm a judge and I'm looking at this, or a viewer looking at this from a distance, I can see, oh, this is the beginning of a chapter because it's a different color. It stands out, easy to assess. And then if I pick a random page later in the chapter, I can still see this sort of grayed out indication of where I am in the exhibit, what part of the plan I'm in, and then an indication of sort of what I'm going to see on that particular page. There are lots of other ways to do similar things, but effective exhibits tend to be very, very literal about where they are in the plan and what's going to be shown on that page. And then that carries over. We talked about microstructure. This is a one chapter for my exhibit. I picked it because it's the shortest chapter. But for each of my exhibits, I pick the same, I guess, microstructure or structure of the chapter. Right. Start with the basic types, the perforation varieties. Then they'll talk about plate flaws, or plate varieties, printing varieties, shades, double impressions, that kind of thing. And then uses, perforation varieties and the uses. We talked earlier about having a very detailed, a very consistent logical structure. For my topic, this is a structure that works well. I mirror this across every chapter. If you're exhibiting a different type of exhibit, different type of chapter, a different type of structure would work equally well. The key is to have a logical and consistent structure from chapter to chapter. All right. Our last topic is to talk briefly about write-ups. Uh, Pun intended. A big stumbling block for new exhibitors is overwriting their exhibit. We're very excited about the topic we're presenting. We've done a lot of research. We've got a lot of knowledge that we want to share. We're excited about it. And so oftentimes new exhibits are just overwritten, just way too much text. As you're thinking about describing particular items in your exhibit, follow the watchwords on the screen. It should be brief, simple, and easy to understand. Another way that I often think about it is you think about the descriptions in an effective auction catalog, right? If you're looking at the Siegel catalog for the gross sale that's coming up in a couple of weeks, they're just little bite-sized chunks, right? Very brief descriptions. They know you're not going to read an essay. You want to be able to browse the catalog quickly, understand what material is on offer. Same thing in your exhibit, right? It should be a very bite-sized, concise, easy to understand description. Keep it brief. It's fine to use abbreviations. It's fine to omit A's and thes and ands if it helps keep the text tighter. Think about a simple way to convey your information. And if you're oftentimes in exhibits, we want to convey, we have our storyline, but then maybe there's some ancillary information that we're interested in showing to viewers. Find a way to separate that from the key information from your story, so that if the judges are moving quickly or the viewers moving quickly, they'll know that they can skip it. And again, just to emphasize this more time, keep it short. I have a couple of great examples of this, I think. The first one here is an exhibit from Rob Fox, who has just a beautiful exhibit of this 24-cent stamp. Rob's exhibit has incredibly complicated roots and rates. And he is, as you can see on the screen there, has devised this wonderful way that you can just digest it in a bite, right? If Rob wrote this up as a paragraph, it would be hard to read, it'd be confusing, but a viewer rather, can walk up to any page in Rob's exhibit and instantly digest what's going on with the cover. Rob loves ancillary information, but he's put it down here at the bottom, set off by a line. So if I'm a judge and I'm moving through this quickly, or I'm a viewer and I just want to digest his philatelic material, I can ignore it. On the other hand, if I want some more time, I want to dig deeper, I know that that's information that I can read. And also great indications. This happens to be a rare cover, which Rob explains that the beginning of the exhibit is marked with these chevrons. You can quickly see why that cover was marked, why it's rare. And again, we also talked about these running headers at the top here, which make it very easy to understand where this fits in the story and what's on this page. I think this is really a masterful way of very concisely conveying complicated information. I have an example for my exhibit on the next page. Maybe this is slightly less good, but it'll point up some of the things we talked about before. I have lots of information in my exhibit like this that sort of tells a story or sets the stage for particular sections. I understand that judges may not want to read that if they're moving quickly, and so I set it off in blue, explain at the beginning of my exhibit that that's what I'm going to do. Similarly, if there's research, I tell the judges at the beginning I'm going to set it up with a magnifying glass. We have this blue border that tells the judges that this is an unusual item or a rare item. Sort of quickly explain why why it has that designation. Some of these items have certificates, which I note below them. But this is a page that has a fair bit of information, but you can read very quickly. You can look at this cover, understand why it's there, understand why it's interesting, and move on. All right, last slide, and then hopefully we'll take some additional questions. I've put here some of my favorite resources as I'm thinking about the topics we talked about today. Again, about defining the scope of your exhibit, about creating an effective structure, and then sort of writing up your exhibit and realizing that structure. American Association of Philatelic Exhibitors has a huge database of exhibits that are free to members and non-members. And the exhibits range in sort of meta level from large gold grand prize winning exhibits down to novice exhibits. It's super, super instructive to take some time and look through those. You'll find ideas that will help you tell your story. You'll see ways that people have succeeded or maybe failed to set a good purpose and then realize it. Super useful. They also have a great quarterly journal about exhibiting. And I think particularly notable for people who are getting started, they have an exhibit critique service. If you're an AAPE member, you can send a title page to or a photocopy of a whole exhibit, and a judge will look at it and give you some helpful feedback. I've talked about this a number of times, but again, read that manual of philatelic judging. Super, super useful to figure out what's going on. One of my favorite books, besides Andy's book about the synopses, is his Path to Gold. This is available on the AAP website. I think it's also on Amazon. Uh, Super useful book of bite-sized articles about how to more effectively structure your exhibit, tell your story. I recommend going to feedback sessions at stamp shows. Even if you're not exhibiting, sit in the back and listen to judges' feedback, figure out where people have stumbled and where they've succeeded, and particularly people who are showing things like you or like you want to show. And last, if you're really desperate, I'm kidding. I'm happy to be a resource. If there's follow-up questions, ideas, thoughts, please. I love talking about this stuff and thinking about it. So my email address is there on the screen, and I'd be more than delighted to hear from anyone on the webinar down the road.
Great. Thank you so much, Andrew. That was just incredibly interesting and such a brilliantly structured presentation. So, on behalf of everybody, thank you. We have two questions.
Great.
The first is from the idea to the finish of an exhibit product, what's a realistic time frame to put it together?
That's a really hard question. Um, in my own work, I tend to be very iterative, and I want to look at something and think about it and let it and sort of digest it. And so my exhibit, I probably spent, I don't know, from the moment I decided I wanted to exhibit to the first time I showed it was probably 18 months, something like that, maybe longer than that. But I went through an awful lot of revisions. I think if you're a really focused exhibitor, really organized thinker, I think you could realistically put together an effective exhibit in a few months. But you'd want to be really intentional about thinking about your scope and your plan before you really got into the laying things out, so you don't wind up doing that um, repeatedly.
Yes. Okay. Excellent. Excellent. I also know someone who's a veteran exhibitor that said, local and regional shows are a great place to float an exhibit out that you're kind of working your way through to see how it goes. And I think that's not a bad idea either as you're developing it. And if you're not sure about something, put your exhibit in and see what the judges have to say.
I think that's absolutely right. The other thing I would say is I know for myself as a novice exhibitor, I was terrified, right? I hadn't exhibited in 25 years. I was afraid people were going to laugh at me or whatever. I was fortunate to be very successful. But what I found was that judges are judges because they love exhibiting, they love philately, and judges get really excited uh, when there's a new exhibitor.
Right.
I was thinking about my experience just a couple weeks ago in at Westpex. We had a large number of new exhibits, which was great. And I think the people I was the most excited to interact with were people who were just getting started. They made some mistakes. They hadn't heard this. They could have used this lecture to construct their exhibit a little more tightly. But I love talking to them and giving them encouragement and figuring out ways that they can more effectively tell their story. Judges are not going to make fun of you uh, or belittle you or embarrass you. Judges are excited about people who want to do this, and they will lean in to help. So even if you jump in at a national show, uh, you should expect support and encouragement, not criticism or embarrassment.
Exactly. So we said the philatelic police have been defunded, so they will not show.
I think that's right.
And then the last question is, if you're not a software expert, how do you cope with layout, color, mats, etc., which seem to be key to viewer recognition?
That's a great question. As you mentioned, I'm a kind of an InDesign nerd, and so I probably overdo it with that. You could make an incredibly effective exhibit with a typewriter. I've seen effective hand-lettered exhibits or exhibits where people use Microsoft Word and just do very basic layout. And for color, a lot of really effective exhibits just use hopefully acid-free construction paper. You
Right.
want to highlight an item, cut it, get some scissors or a straight edge and cut a square, mount your cover to that square, mount it in your page. Um, it's really the layout is really something the exhibitors focus on the most, and is really probably the least important part of an effective exhibit. It's
Right.
only the presentation is only 5 points out of 100 where the judges evaluate your exhibit. As long as the judges and the viewer can understand what you're doing, the how you lay it out is really not that important.
Terrific. Terrific. That's great. Well, again, thank you so much for this. It's been so helpful, and I know I've learned a lot. And we're very grateful for you taking time to come and share with the RPSC. And it's I know that you've made a large number of fans and people that will now follow you. So that's very exciting. Thank you.
Well, I'm grateful to be here. Thank you all for putting up with me on that. And sorry again about the video camera, but come find me at a stamp show and we'll meet in person down the road.
That's great. I did want to announce that the winner of David Piercy's book in this, according to my crack team of helpers, is Kate Ratcliffe, who's from Ontario. So, Kate, you can find my email address on the RPSC website under Society, rpsc.org. And just send me an email with your address, and we'll get that out to you along with last week's winner as soon as we're done with the series, okay? Terrific. So thank you everybody for coming, and we hope you'll come back and join us next week for Andrew McFarland's part 3. The what someone referred to me when I started exhibiting again as the dreaded synopsis. And I know he's going to have some exciting things to tell us and help us not be quite so afraid of that part of it. So thank you everybody, and good night, and we'll see you next week.